Hey guys, Jason here. I want to show you something real quick. So this is my semi-famous pedal board. Thank you for all the views, by the way. As you can see, I've already switched up a couple of things. I got the Dimension C because I'm going stereo tonight, and I switched out the fuzz pedal because I wanted that dying battery sound, and no other pedal does it quite as good as the MXR Variac fuzz. But I get a lot of questions about this pedal board on social media, and I figured most of them would be about, I don't know, like this row of pedals. But interestingly, most of the questions are about this guy. This is the Bloom compressor from Jackson Audio. They also make this pedal, the Golden Boy, which is hands down my favorite drive I've ever used. Maybe I'll do a video about this soon, but today we're talking about this guy, and specifically, what the hell does it do? Well, besides the EQ and the clean boost, both of which are great, its primary function is compression. Compression, in my experience, is a bit of a confusing topic for a lot of musicians. It's sort of a mysterious effect because it's so subtle. Other effects you can hear more clearly. It's not hard to understand an effect that makes your guitar, bass, drum, vocal sound crunchy or wiggly or like it's in the Grand Canyon. But compression is one of those things you don't really notice until it's gone, and maybe not even then. I often think of details like this as pro stuff, the little things that add up to make the difference between something sounding professional or not. So maybe you've never used a compressor pedal or plug-in before, or maybe you're like I was for many years. You use them, but you don't fully understand what it's doing. But today we're going to talk about compression, what it is, what it does, and how it can help you sound better. First, hi, I'm Jason. Like, subscribe, etc. So maybe you're a little afraid that I might be about to bore you to death with a lot of talk about the science behind it. And I can promise you I will not do that. Plus, it's not like I'm an expert or anything. I don't have a degree in audio engineering. Everything I know about compression is just from years of using it in the real world and then double checking my information with people who really know about this stuff. But everything I'm about to tell you is aimed squarely at practical application and actually making music. So as far as a short definition of compression, you've probably heard the description that it makes the loud things softer and the soft things louder. And that's sort of true, but how exactly does it do that? Essentially, a compressor is just narrowing the volume range of the output of your track or instrument. And there are two fundamental ways of doing this. There's upward compression and downward compression. They do the exact same thing, just in opposite directions. Downward compression will reduce the volume of anything that goes above a certain set level. This is called the threshold. Upward compression, on the other hand, will raise the volume of anything that goes below that set level, basically reaching the same goal just using opposing methods. Now, downward compression is by far the more commonly used kind of compression, though upward has its place, and I highly recommend you check that out. But for today, we're going to focus on downward compression. Spoiler alert, what's going to happen is the compressor is going to reduce the louder sounds and then use something called makeup gain to raise the volume of the entire output signal to compensate for the volume lost by compressing the sound. In effect, it's doing exactly as advertised by making the louder sounds softer and then making the softer sounds louder by raising the volume of the entire narrowed signal. But let's talk about the little details that go into that process. So say I have a snare drum. It could be anything, but a drum hit is a better illustration for what's happening inside a compressor. So the sound goes through the compressor and it registers the decibel level of each hit, especially the beginning, which is called the transient. So the compressor sees how loud the transient is, and the very first thing is to check if that sound has surpassed the threshold that's been set. If it doesn't, then the compressor does nothing. But if it does, the compressor goes to work. And there are a couple of other settings that determine how the compressor will react. The ratio is determining how hard the compressor will push down the signal. And it is actually a mathematical ratio. For every X number of decibels the signal goes above the threshold, the compressor will allow Y number of decibels to be output. So a 1-to-1 compression is effectively no compression because 1 times 1 equals 1. 2-to-1 will allow 1 extra decibel of volume for every 2 decibels it goes above the threshold. So for example, if the signal goes 6 dB above the threshold, then you're only getting 3 dB of extra volume. This is considered a very light, gentle compression, so it's going to be subtle and hard to notice right away. 3 to 1 is a pretty moderate compression. Once you start to get up to like 5, 6, 7 to 1, that's pretty strong compression, and you'll really start to hear it in the sound. And at the very top, there is infinity to 1. This is a very hard compression. It's what's referred to as brick wall limiting. So you might have heard of a limiter and wondered, well, what's the difference between a compressor and a limiter? Well, as far as what's going on under the hood, the only true difference between a compressor and a limiter is the ratio. So if you were to take a compressor and crank the ratio all the way up, you have effectively turned it into a limiter. There are a few more settings for further dialing in how the compressor reacts to the sound. You'll see them on plugins and studio hardware, though not very often on guitar pedals, although some do have them. First, there is attack and release. As you can probably guess, these control how fast the compressor starts working after the sound has gone above the threshold, the attack, and how long it takes the compressor to let off compressing the sound after it has gone back below the threshold, the release. These are really important to how the compressor both sounds and feels. A slower attack will make the compressor less noticeable, almost invisible, because past a certain amount, the compressor will only be compressing the longer sustained notes, because the shorter, faster notes will be gone before the attack has time to catch up. Now, if you have a really fancy compressor, you might see something called knee on it. So when it's set to 0 or a kneeless compression, the compressor doesn't start working until the threshold has actually been crossed. But turning up the knee will cause the compressor to begin gradually working a little bit early below the threshold, which will have the compressor roll in a little more smoothly. Now, in describing it, it might sound like it's kind of doing the same thing as the attack, but it's doing it in a very different way, so it's going to get some different results. And finally, at the end of this process, the makeup gain will raise the overall volume of the entire compressed sound. This is really helpful because in reducing the peaks of a sound, you lose the overall loudness of it, so it's generally recommended that you turn up the makeup gain so that the output volume is roughly equal to that of when the compressor is turned off. This way you can turn the compressor on and off and really hear the difference that it's making. And finally, a really useful feature showing up in almost all modern compressors is a blend control, which, as you can probably guess, controls the blend between the compressed sound and the clean uncompressed sound. So you can say it's a full-on compression or a 50-50 blend or clean with just a tiny bit of compression or anywhere on that spectrum. This is, in the studio world, called parallel compression. This is really useful because it allows you to dial in a more aggressive compression sound and really get the benefits of that while still maintaining the natural attack and character of the original sound, but still get the benefits of compression. Now, for extra credit, you can look into other types of compressors. There's solid state, optical, FET compressors, and they each have a different sound and character to them. And there's different modes of compression like peak and RMS and expansion, which is wild because it literally does the exact opposite of compression. It makes it louder. So let's talk about what are the practical benefits of compression. So compression is great for maintaining a consistent volume level, for preventing overloading or clipping or distorting, for enhancing sustain, dulling transients. It can make an instrument or a voice sound more present or in your face in a mix, and it can also pull out softer, more nuanced information in any track. The first thing I noticed about a compressor in the studio setting was when I put a compressor on a whole drum kit or a drum loop, it made the hi-hat and the little ghost notes on the snare drum really jump out. It's also really useful for controlling more harsh frequencies in a sound. This is typically called de-essing. And overall, it's just really good for making a whole band sound cohesive and glued together. So my philosophy on compression, I work in a few different styles, but the genre I really readily identify in is pop music. Pop is where my heart is. And in pop music, compression is a big part of the style. Having all the various elements of a pop track be controlled and consistent and tightly glued together is pretty essential for having a clean, punchy, powerful sound. And having more extreme variations in volume is acceptable and even really cool in other genres, but primarily in pop, rock, and hip-hop music, you kind of want your instruments to stay within a set range, and that's what compression does. All right, so now we're looking at my pedal board and particularly the Bloom compressor. What you're hearing is my board plugged directly into my audio interface. My amps are the Walrus ACS-1. This is my clean tone. So taking a closer look at the Jackson Audio Bloom and everything it does, first off, it is a compressor. So you can hear it doing a little bit of the work of compressing the sound, but it's not a really aggressive sound. That's primarily because, as you can see, the blend knob I have set at 132 o'clock-ish, which gives me about 60% clean tone and 40% compression. If I were to turn it all the way down so it's all compressed signal, it sounds like... So that sound is pretty squashed, but with it set to about a 60-40 blend of clean and compressed, I still get the attack and the sound of the strings, but I get that extra sustain and just controlling the super high peaks in my sound. Then hear how long it sustains with the compressor on. And without the compressor, so I can definitely hear some extra sustain from the guitar, especially in that middle part of the decay, but it also has these other two features, the 3-band EQ and the clean boost. So if I hit both foot switches, it turns on the EQ. So if I want to... So really useful for when, say, I'm switching guitars and one is significantly darker or brighter than the other, or if I just feel like I'm not getting quite the sound I need, I can just really quickly cut or boost one of these frequencies, and it almost always does the trick. And the volume boost is an extremely clean boost. A lot of volume boost pedals will have a certain EQ profile to them. They'll cut out a certain amount of low end or maybe boost or do some particular carving in certain frequencies, and that can be useful depending on the context you're using them in. But the boost on the Jackson Audio Bloom is completely flat across the entire frequency spectrum, even down to sub frequency. So it's really going to be the exact same sound from your guitar, just louder. So I turn on the boost at 0, it's at unity. And that's only halfway up the knob, so you can imagine just how loud that thing gets. I believe the volume boost gets up to 20 decibels in gain, so halfway up, that was 10 dB, which was absolutely crushing my ACS1. And another cool thing about the volume boost is the bloom feature. So if you hold down the foot switch, it'll gradually bring in the volume boost. So if I set it back to about 10 dB, play my chord. And it'll swell in that volume boost. It does the same thing turning it off. So a pretty cool feature for when you don't want the volume boost just suddenly clicking in, or maybe you want to add that extra bit of sustain to the end of a note. It's a really natural way to do it. But for me, the coolest feature of the Bloom is the different compression modes. If you hold down this foot switch, it flashes, and then you can cycle through these different colors, which represent the different compression modes, almost all of which are just different combinations of attack and release time. So the first mode, white, is what they call limit mode. It's an extremely fast attack time of 2.5 milliseconds. So it's most like the behavior of a limiter. So it's just going to clamp down on the sound really quickly. The second mode, green, is what they call country mode. It's 7.5 milliseconds. Not quite as fast as limit mode, but still pretty quick, so it works great with a lot of fast picking. The third mode, which is the purple mode, they call that R&B mode, that gets up to 50 milliseconds. So a moderately fast grip on the peaks, but still giving you a lot of front end attack on the transients of the note. And number 4, the blue, they call it ballad mode. That is 120 milliseconds, which is pretty slow. So you're going to get a lot of the front end of the note, and then the compressor rolls in to give you that extra sustain. And then the 5th mode is the aqua color, and they call this slide mode because it's actually 2 compressors in series. So you have the main compressor that you control with these knobs, and there's a second compressor that you control with little trim pots inside the pedal. So the 2 compressors are in series, which means the first compressor feeds into the second compressor before going out of the pedal. This is an old trick that was utilized by country slide and pedal steel players like Lowell George. They would take 2 LA2A rack compressors, put them in series, so it would give the guitar near endless sustain while still having a relatively clean tone. So this mode is really great to turn on whenever I play slide on stage. As advertised, it gives me a ton of sustained and a super compressed even sound. And finally, the 6th mode, orange, is just the internal compressor by itself. Another cool feature of this pedal is the LED will react to your playing, so you have an actual visual representation of what the compressor is doing in real time. So a couple of general tips for using a compressor pedal. One thing I like to do is set the output of the pedal just slightly louder than my clean signal with the pedal turned off. That tiny bit of extra boost makes my drive pedals and my amps feel a little more reactive. So you'll notice when I turn the compressor pedal on, it's not noticeably louder. There's just a little bit of extra breakup coming from the amp. As opposed to the other thing to think about is how much compression is too much compression. That's not really something I can answer for you because it really comes down to how you play the guitar, how your hands hit the strings, and how it interacts with your whole guitar rig. But for a general rule of thumb is you want to start with a small amount, turn it up until it feels like too much, and then back off. And there's sort of 2 stages to that with a pedal like this, where you have the actual amount of compression, and then you also have the clean blend. But as I've shown before, I actually like to set it to where it's a pretty aggressive amount of compression. So without it, with it. So that's really squashed, but then I'm making up for that with the amount of clean signal I'm blending in. So I'm still getting the sound of the guitar, the sound of the strings. It's just giving me that little bit of control on the edges of the sound. And I just like how it makes my whole guitar playing just sound and feel more even overall. And then the way that interacts with my drive pedals is something that I prefer just because of the way that I play and the way that I set up my drives. Some more drive would sound like without it, with it. It's subtle, but it just gives me a more predictable sound from my drive pedals. I like to know exactly what I'm getting out of them. Now, some guitar players I know prefer to turn the compressor off while they have any drives on and then turn the compressor on only when they're playing clean, which makes a ton of sense because drive pedals give you a natural little bit of extra volume. So when they're playing clean, the compressor can compensate for that volume to make your whole sound more even. Also, because drive pedals give a bit of natural compression anyway, so with a compressor pedal and a drive pedal on, you're kind of getting two stages of compression. So it's really easy for your sound to become over compressed. So it's important to know that that is happening and set your drive pedals and your compressor pedal accordingly. Now, I'm the kind of guy that likes to have his compressor pedal on almost all of the time because I like the way it evens out my sound and it makes the way all of the other pedals on my board react more predictable. And lastly, the other big factor that needs to be talked about with compression is how it makes your instrument feel. So when playing through a compressor pedal or in any situation where there is compression in the signal chain that you're hearing live, it really does change the way that the instrument feels in your hands. So even if it doesn't necessarily sound any different, you'll notice a difference in how the instrument reacts to the way you play it. I know for me, even though I'm not using the compressor in a super obvious way, I like the way that a compressor makes the guitar feel more alive in my hands. So maybe your audience will never hear what a compressor does, but it can be a somewhat essential part of your performance as a musician. This is one of many ways that your gear kind of becomes an extension of you, the musician, in more ways than might be obvious. So I think this stuff is important because thoroughly getting to know the tools with which you make music just makes you that much more able to clearly express yourself as a musician, which is always and forever the goal. Okay, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments below what compressor are you using, how do you use it, and why do you like it? I'm Jason. Love you guys.